The woman was found in her own apartment, but the police could not find a single piece of evidence. As the case became known throughout the city, they received a tip from a witness that turned the investigation around and ultimately led to the truth. As a result, this case became one of the most discussed throughout the country, because no one could have expected this. Shona Deefy was born on March 13, 1966 in the American city of Salt Lake City. She was a cheerful and energetic girl, was on the school cheerleading team, and had many friends. After graduating, Shona worked in her home state for a while, but at the age of 29 she decided to move to Las Vegas. She liked the fast pace of the city, which also offered many more opportunities for earning money. After moving, Shona worked as a cosmetics saleswoman for several elite companies. But in 2001, she decided to take a job as a waitress at the Palms Casino. At that time, this establishment had just opened, but it very quickly became one of the most popular casinos in Vegas. It was at this job that Shona met her future husband, George. He often visited the casino, and a romance quickly began between them. A year after they met, the couple had a daughter, Madison. A few years later, they officially got married. It seemed that a happy and carefree future awaited this family. George worked as a fireman, paid a lot of attention to his wife and daughter, and always took care of them. Shona worked in a casino, earning very decent money there. But since 2008, their relationship has gone into discord. Due to the financial crisis, George lost an impressive part of his savings, which were invested in the real estate market. Because of this, he became nervous and irritable, increasingly taking out his anger on his wife and daughter. Ultimately, the woman decided that they should live separately for a while and moved into her own apartment. The couple went to a family psychologist, but there was no improvement in their relationship, and they increasingly discussed divorce. Another blow for Shona was that her apartment was burglarized while she was at work. Several valuables were taken from the house, including her engagement ring. But a separate strange moment was that the thief also took her swimming trunks and left men's underpants in the apartment. The woman contacted the police, but they were unable to identify the culprit. On the morning of September 29, 2019, 3 weeks after this incident, George took his daughter from her grandmother and went to Shona to take some of her daughter's things. He and his wife continued to share custody of her, and her daughter had to spend a few days with him. As they approached the apartment, they saw that the garage door was open. When they entered the house, real horror awaited them. Shona was lying on the floor. There was blood everywhere. Her daughter, who was only 8 years old at that time, witnessed this terrible picture. George immediately called the police and reported what had happened. The 911 operator asked him and his daughter to go outside and wait for officers. Investigators began studying the crime scene and determined that Shona was most likely attacked near the stairs on the second floor of the apartment. Medical examiners found serious injuries on Shona's body and initially thought the cause of death may have been a gunshot wound. However, very soon they realized that in fact all these injuries were inflicted by a heavy blunt object, most likely a hammer. After interviewing neighbors, police received 2 leads. One of the neighbors said that closer to the morning he heard a roar from the woman's apartment, but did not attach any importance to it. Because I knew that Shona was returning from work at that time. Meanwhile, the victim's sister suspected George of what happened. She constantly communicated with Shona and knew about all the problems in their relationship, about constant jealousy and scandals on his part. However, his alibi was undisputed, so the police focused on finding other evidence. A day after the discovery of the body, they received their first serious lead. By that time, the killer was all over the local news, which attracted the attention of the residents of Vegas. A man who knew a homeless man nicknamed Greyhound contacted the police. He told this witness that he killed the woman with a hammer. According to the man, Greyhound talked about this with joy and even laughed. Considering that the details of the murder were not disclosed in the media, this clue became key for detectives. They found out that the witness lived in a tent on the outskirts of town and often saw a greyhound near the Albertsons store. Together with him, they went there and began to wait. Very soon, a witness saw him and informed the police, who immediately approached the suspect. During the search, they found illegal substances on him, which allowed Greyhound to be arrested. At the police station, the police found out that his real name was Noel Stevens. He was repeatedly charged with petty theft and possession of various substances, but the man denied his involvement in the murder, and the investigators really doubted his candidacy for the role of suspect. Firstly, he had always committed only minor offenses, and it was difficult to imagine why this homeless man would kill a person. Secondly, he lived practically on the other side of the city, which made the choice of victim completely incomprehensible. It took him several hours to get to Shona's house, and many of the really valuable things in her apartment were untouched, including cash. None of this made any sense, but the police continued to look into his involvement. They found the tent where Stevens lived and searched it. The tent was located outside the city, in a deserted, remote area. Having begun to study the area around her, investigators found several serious clues. Just a few dozen meters away, they found the suspect's pants and underwear covered in blood, as well as a hammer tack. Experts later determined that the blood belonged to Shona, but the main evidence was waiting for them at the police station itself. Having gained access to Noel's smartphone, they found only one contact in his address book. George D'Affey's number was there. At this point, things took an unexpected turn. From conversations with Shona's friends and relatives, investigators found out that George had been friends with a homeless man for several years, to whom he entrusted various tasks around the house and yard. The woman often complained about him to her friends when he came to fix something. According to her, he behaved strangely, even creepily, but George never took her concerns seriously. Thus, detectives found the missing link between the victim's killer. But they still had the main question: does George have anything to do with this, or did Stevens only choose the woman as a victim because he knew Shona and her work schedule? Using the tag, the police found out when and in which store the hammer, which was most likely the murder weapon, was purchased. Having requested surveillance footage, they were shocked by what they saw. The footage showed Stevens, accompanied by George, entering the store and buying the same hammer. At this point, they realized that Shona's husband could indeed be the organizer of this terrible murder. When all this evidence was laid out in front of Stevens, he finally decided to confess to what he had done. The man admitted that he really killed Shona, but did it only on the orders of her husband. According to Noel, George paid him $600 for this. She and George had been preparing to commit this crime for several months. The man bought Stevens dark clothes and gave her duplicate keys to her apartment. 3 weeks before the murder, he asked a homeless man to break into her house and set up a robbery, so that later the police would be confused and conduct their investigation along this line. On the night of the murder, he snuck into the apartment again and waited for the woman to return home. After she arrived and began to climb to the second floor, he came out of his hiding place and attacked her. Noel added that he struck her about 17 times, causing the hammer to break. The killer agreed to show detectives the place near the tent where he buried his tip. With Stevens' confession and a ton of evidence in hand, the police charged George. His relatives were shocked. After all, for them he was always a caring and loving family man who helped people. Upon learning of these accusations, his sisters called George and informed him that he was suspected of murder. Immediately after this call, he got into his pickup truck and tried to escape from the city. But on the way out, the man crashed into a fence and flew off the highway. The police who arrived at the scene concluded that he deliberately provoked this accident in an attempt to take his own life. This was evidenced by the complete absence of tire tracks on the car's path. George didn't even try to brake, he just stepped on the gas. However, he failed to achieve his goal, and, with moderate injuries, the man was taken to a local hospital. 2 days later, police informed him that he had been arrested on murder charges. George's reaction was very calm. He asked that his lawyer be contacted, and that he be given the opportunity to shower and brush his teeth. From that point on, the police department began preparing to take the case to trial. 3 months later, Noel Stevens agreed to make a full confession in exchange for waiving the death penalty. George DeFeer refused to admit his guilt. His trial began only 3 years later, in August 2015. At the meetings, he did not utter a word, entrusting all the work to his lawyer. His relatives acted as witnesses and said that George could never do this to his wife and could not be involved in her murder. His defense was based on the fact that Stevens killed Shauna on his own initiative and his husband did not know about it. According to the lawyer, recordings from the store cameras did not prove anything. They only showed George and Noel buying tools that the latter needed for housework. The prosecution did not believe in this turn of events. At the trial, they presented a transcript of George's phone calls, according to which the man called Stevens 87 times in September 2012, of which 5 calls were made shortly before the murder. Based on Stevens' testimony, the prosecution concluded that money was the motive for the murder. George lost a significant part of his savings, as a result of which Shauna began to bring the main income to the family. She earned more than $100,000 a year. At a time when George's income was half that, he understood that in the event of a divorce or division of property, he would be left with nothing, so he decided to get rid of his wife. Stevens said he didn't believe him at first when he started talking about murder. Before this, they had been friends for several years. He did various jobs around the house and yard for a small fee. Ultimately, George offered him $5,000 to kill his wife, and he agreed. According to him, the man planned to receive this money from the insurance company after Shauna's death. Despite the fact that Stevens told all the details of the murder and how he and George planned a crime, certain difficulties arose during the trial. At the meeting, the results of Stevens' medical testimony were presented, according to which the man often suffered from visual and auditory hallucinations, and also regularly took a potent illegal substance. He did not deny these points, so all his words were questioned by the lawyer. Because of this, neither side was certain of the outcome when the jury began deliberating its decision. It took them 3 days, but George TFA was eventually found guilty of conspiracy to murder. When the judge said these words, George showed no emotion. He was sentenced to life in prison, with an additional 81 years added on other charges, including conspiracy to break into another's home and robbery. Shortly after the verdict, George filed a 107-page appeal, in which he confessed to the crime in a third party. He wrote that prescription drugs had clouded his judgment, leaving him unable to distinguish right from wrong. All this led to the point where the man sincerely believed that killing his wife would be the only way to protect their child. George said that several years before the murder he suffered a serious injury, but the court did not order a psychological examination for him. Despite all this, in 2017 the court rejected his appeal because they had no reason to doubt that his mental state prevented him from being clearly aware of what was happening. Since George's arrest, their daughter has been living with her maternal grandmother and actively helping Shauna's sister. At one point, this girl lost both her parents and found out what a monster her father was. He deliberately took her to the apartment, knowing in advance what she would see there. Obviously, he did this to provide a more reliable alibi, without worrying at all about the consequences for the psyche of his child. As for Stevens, he received 42 years in prison. Given that this man lived most of his life on the street, it would be stupid to consider such a sentence a punishment.